Welcome to the Wyoming Department of Revenue's tutorial for the Form 41-1. The intent of this video is to guide you through the process for completing the form that is commonly used by monthly and quarterly filers in the state of Wyoming. When completing the form, your first step is to enter your total gross sales into line A. These sales will represent both taxable and non-taxable sales. However, it should not include the collected taxes at this time. Line B is where you will subtract any exemptions. Exemptions in this case are any sales that you have made that were considered non-taxable according to Wyoming Statute 39-15-105, which lists those sales and leases that are exempt from sales tax. Please note that exemptions are construed narrowly. Exemptions are legislative acts of grace from the normal rule of taxability. It is the responsibility of the purchaser to be certain that an exemption is available. It is the responsibility of the vendor to be certain that the purchaser's exemption is documented. By law, vendors must retain copies of exemption certificates and direct pay permits of exempt transactions for audit purposes for a minimum of 3 years. After you subtract line B from line A, you will enter the total into line C. This is your total sales that are considered taxable in the state of Wyoming. Keep in mind that some businesses may never have any exempt sales, so they would just enter the total sales from line A into line C. At this point, you will drop down to Part 2 and complete this section before returning to line D. This is where you will report the amount of tax collected for any reporting jurisdictions that you have made. Keep in mind, you can find the jurisdiction name and digit codes in the vendor's manual as well as online at the following web address. In this case, the business had sales of $10,635.87 that occurred in Natrona County at a tax rate of 5%, which would equal $531.79 in reportable tax collected. This figure would be entered into column 4, Sales Tax Due. At this point, when you add up the amount of tax you actually collected from your invoices or receipts, it is possible that you may have actually overcollected tax. This can occur either by rounding up or possibly a mistake in the math during the sale. If the overcollection was not refunded to the customer, then you are required to list the excess tax that you collected into column 6. In this case, there was $1.14 that was overcollected. Please keep in mind that if you undercollect tax, then the whole amount owed is still due to the state of Wyoming. Column 5 is used to report any use tax owed by a vendor who has made purchases outside of the state of Wyoming for their own use. This does not refer to any items that the vendor buys with the intent to resell to their customers. Examples of this would be if you were to purchase a computer, point of sale system, cash register, tables and chairs, display cases, tools, etc. that you are using in the course of your business with no intention of selling them to a customer. In this case, the vendor had purchased an item outside of the state of Wyoming and they were not charged any tax on the item that they were consuming. The item cost $1,000, so they will enter $50 into column 5. If the vendor had paid 3% tax to that other state for the purchase, then the state of Wyoming would have given them a consideration for the tax paid, and they would only have to report $20 in this column. In the case that the vendor would have purchased the item in a state where the tax rate was higher than the vendor's home county rate, then the vendor would not have to report any tax due. Please keep in mind that if you are in a county that the tax rate is different from the 5% in the example, then whatever the tax rate for your county will apply. Next, you will add the totals from columns 4, 5, and 6 together and report them into column 7. The vendor in this case also had sales in Laramie County of $6,753.25 at a tax rate of 6%. So in column 1, you will list the jurisdictional codes and the tax rate for Laramie County. Then you will report the tax due into column 4, which would be $405.20. In this case, there was no excess tax due, so you will carry the total from column 4 over to column 7. At this time, you will add the two totals together and enter them into line K. In the case that the vendor may have more than 2 jurisdictions to report for, Then you may need to contact the Wyoming Department of Revenue for a supplemental Form 41-2 and complete it for the additional counties that need to be reported. In this case, the vendor made sales in Park and Goshen counties. So following the same format that was used in Part 2, you will enter the proper jurisdictional codes and tax rates into columns 1, 2, and 3. The vendor had sales in Park County of $2,345.17 at a tax rate of 4%, which would equal $93.81. They also had sales of $992.95 in Goshen County at a tax rate of 5.25%. This would equal $52.13. These amounts will be reported in column 4 and carried over into column 7, being that there is no excess tax collected. Once you have recorded all of your sales, then those totals will be added together and listed at the bottom of the Form 41-2. Then you will carry that figure over to the Form 41-1 and enter the total into line L. You will then indicate the number of supplemental pages that were used in the box provided. Since we only used one, we will indicate this here. At this point, you will add lines K and L and place the total into line M. Then this figure will be carried up to line D for the total jurisdictional taxes due. The vendor in this example does not provide lodging, so line E will be left blank, or you may enter 0. Then you will carry the figure from line D and enter it into line F for the total taxes due. This brings us to the vendor compensation credit. In order to qualify for this, your account must be in good standing with the state of Wyoming, which means all returns currently due must be filed and paid in full, and the account may not have any outstanding balances. Also, the return must be filed and paid for by the 15th of the month instead of waiting until the end of the month when it is due. Vendors are allowed a credit of 1.95% of the tax due for the first $6,250 in collected tax. Anything over that is calculated at 1%. Please note that vendor compensation credit may not exceed $500 in any reporting period. And the vendor in this case means the ownership, not the individual licenses. Please refer to the vendor's manual or contact the Wyoming Department of Revenue if you have any questions. So in this case, the vendor is filing and paying their return by the 15th of the month, and they are eligible for the credit. Since they have $1,134.07 owing in sales tax, they will multiply that amount by 0.0195, and this would equal $22.11 in vendor compensation credit. This figure would then be entered into line G. Line H is an area in which you can record any penalties and interest or late fees that you may owe the state of Wyoming due to delinquent returns, late fees, or etc. Keep in mind that if this does pertain to you, then in turn you will be disqualified from taking the vendor compensation credit. So in this case, nothing is owed and it can be left blank, or you may enter 0. Line I is used for a credit memo. You can receive a credit from an overpayment or a vendor compensation credit that was not used, or even an amended return on the account. It is always advised that if the state shows a credit listed on your return, that you contact the Department of Revenue to verify that the amount of the credit is accurate. In this case, the vendor has a valid credit on the account of $15. You will then subtract lines G and I from line F. This will give you the total amount due to the state of Wyoming. It is incredibly important that you sign your return and complete the information to the right. The return can be rejected if it has not been signed or if your math is not correct. Please be careful that you do not date the return in the area directly below the signature line unless your intention is to close your license. This concludes our tutorial. Please keep in mind, if you have any questions or concerns, you may contact the Wyoming Department of Revenue at the following numbers. We truly appreciate all of our Wyoming vendors. Thank you.